Knowing that I was going to be following John, I thought that what I could probably do was pick up on this question of what history of science, technology, medicine has to say to science, technology, innovation studies, because it seems to me, I mean, Robin started off by saying, this morning by saying that science, technology studies and innovation studies started off very close together and to an extent have tended to diverge into slightly different disciplinary formations, and he's interested in exploring how they might be reconciled. Likewise, I think history of STM and science, technology and innovation studies started off really very, very deeply enmeshed, certainly in the case of the Edinburgh School. To an extent, there's been, I think, a tendency for some divergence to occur as well. So historians of science, technology and medicine, whenever I say historians of science, that now means all of these, have increasingly moved out into history departments and often are doing things like which go under the sort of banner, quite self-declared banner of cultural history, which means that they don't look at the science, they look at sort of popular thinking and the symbolism and interpretations and so on. So there has been, I think, a tendency for some historians of science at least to cease to engage quite so closely with the technical detail of science. And increasingly, I think STS has tended to, having gone through this period when history was very important, has now increasingly come to focus on more contemporary issues for very good reasons. I don't want to decry this, but I do want to think about how history can still be important for science, technology and innovation studies and what it can offer to science, technology and innovation studies. And there's three sort of key areas where I think history of science, etc., can be very important. One is that it's simply a great source of case studies of how science has been different from what science is now. And this is one of the great developments that the STRONG program and that other approaches within science, technology, innovation studies have really brought to our understanding of science. This sense of place as science as localized within particular places. And certainly I think it was the case that for much of the early work in SSK and so on, in science technology studies, that other place that we looked at was the place in the past, the history itself as a different place. And that was really what I wanted to flag up with my title. What was it? The past is a different place. That's actually a totally misquoting L.P. Hartley, who said, the past is a different country, a foreign country, sorry. They do things differently there. And I think that's this sense that the past is a different place, a foreign country, and we can go there to see how different science, technology, and medicine might be in different places. Of course, this developed in parallel with work by Harry Collins and others who looked at contemporary science, but looked at the locality of other places in science. But for much of the demonstration of the context, dependency, the cultural imbrication of science, technology, and medicine, history was fantastically important as a source of case studies. And that itself has a sort of historical roots in that much of this work grew out of the history and philosophy of science, that some of the most important work on which people within science, technology studies drew was itself historical, even within the philosophical tradition. So the work of Ludwig Fleck, the work obviously of Thomas Kuhn, himself a historian as well as a philosopher, and then carried forward by people like Shapin and so on. And deliberately making a very important point. The paper that John cited, the 1982 paper on the history of science and its sociological constructions, was deliberately echoing and responding to a paper from, I think, 1958 by Lakatos, the philosopher of science, who wrote a very important paper called The History of Science, and its rational reconstructions. And for philosophers of science, the thing to do was to go back and to purify earlier historical thought, scientific thought, by bringing it into line with our common sense, rational understanding nowadays. And for Chapin, the important thing was to show it within its own social context, not in the light of present-day ideas of rationality. So, history of science is an important source of valuable case studies of difference, and particularly of the cultural contextuality of and historical contingency of science. But we can find that elsewhere within STS by doing contemporary studies of different places, contemporary places, different laboratories, different epistemic cultures now, if you look at Knord Schettina's work and so on and so forth. So what else can history of science add? Well, one of the things about the history of science and the kinds of case studies that have been done are that we're looking not just at a different science, but we're looking at and locating it in a wider culture that is very obviously very different. So one of the things that it makes it very easy to do, if we were to understand science contextually, is to move out beyond, for instance, Boyle's laboratory, beyond the immediate context of Hooke's work, and to show how it spills out into a much wider set of social, cultural contexts. And I think Jamie was sort of pointing to that when he said that John himself is looking at science in its context. But we can go beyond the immediate sort of textual context into the religious context, into the metaphysical context, into the political context. And obviously, Leviathan and the air pump is a very fine case of how Chapin and Schaffer trace the meanings of science from what happens in the laboratory in Gresham College or in Boyle's house outwards through its ramifications through the culture of the time. So one of the things that historical studies really sort of give us is this sense that we can look not just at science and in an odd local place, but broaden out that sense of place to it's sort of intuitively obvious that the wider cultural context is also very different and very odd. It broadens the scope of our understanding. Whereas I think much of contemporary studies in STS, the tendency has not been to move outwards into the wider culture, but actually to move inwards and to look at the particular local culture of the laboratory and archetypically the laboratory. So one of the great things that work has done is to say that the old internalist-externalist debate, a debate about whether the content of science was informed by issues purely internal to science or by issues external to science, STS has broken down that distinction and said, well, it's all internal and external at once. But the tendency, I think, in contemporary studies has been to narrow the focus and the gaze of our explanatory context, whereas in history, the tendency, I think, has been to move in the other direction. And I think that that is hugely valuable, to keep in mind the sense in which science and the content, the meaning, and so on of science are determined not just by the local context, but by the way in which that context interpenetrates with, is constantly in communication with, a much wider cultural context. So history of science, I think, can help us to maintain this broad cultural vision, this broad cultural purview when thinking about science. Finally, the third thing that I wanted to say that history of science does also help to keep in mind is not just the peculiarity of the past and the historical contingency of the past, but the peculiarity and historical contingency of the present. And it's often easy, I think, to simply take the present for granted. This is something that I think sort of came to me as a historian when I started to move into work on contemporary genomics. And while there's a vast field of work on the modern life sciences, fantastically good, rich sociological research, one of the things that really struck me was just how little sense many of the people working in that area had of just how recent and odd these cultural and epistemological configurations are. Going back further than 10, 12, 15 years, people really lose that sense of just how different even the very recent past was, and how very different the present is, even from things that have gone really quite recently before. Not just that sense, though, of the peculiarity of the present, but also, and this I think is really very important, what history of science gives us is a sense that we don't get from contemporary studies. Comparative studies, you can look at what's going on in Germany or in Japan and think, yes, that's different, how odd it is over there. The foreign countries are foreign countries, they do different things differently there. If you look at the past, that raises questions about how we got from there to here. It raises questions about genealogy, about continuity and difference, about how continuities are maintained, about how differences are created and how they occur. It raises questions about process, and those can be questions which might be micro-sociological, and there's, again, much of the early work in history of science from an STS perspective was about, for instance, how experiments end, how you achieve closure in controversies, but bigger questions about how we go through these big changes from one worldview, one set of institutional relationships to the very different ones that we inhabit now. And I think that sense of thinking about how change occurs in the long term and in the short term is a vastly important addition to our thinking about science, technology, and innovation studies. And especially, it was a real pleasure to hear Johan talking this morning about innovation studies and about the importance of history for doing innovation studies. I think potentially this is one place that STS and innovation studies can start to come together again by thinking about the sorts of historical stories that we tell, the historical narratives, the importance of understanding processes of change within technical systems, within the socio-technical systems, and so on. Just one thing, just a caveat, and just this is immediately to come back to Johan. A number of things that you said made me think that there may be a different kind of historiography at play in STS as we currently do it and in innovation studies. And I just wonder how far this is the case. A couple of things that sort of made me wonder about how you think about historical innovation, historical changes. One thing I was just really taken aback, and I don't know if this means anything or not, when you said there's not been much attention to the importance of war in innovation studies. And yet there's a huge amount in the history of technology on the history of war and what that does for innovation. The work of David Edgerton, for instance, his engagements with Corelli Barnett. I mean, there's major controversies there. War is hugely important for historians. I'm just wondering why it's not been important in innovation studies. So that's one specific thing that I tripped over. The other thing is, I just wonder how far innovation studies still maintains a tendency to introduce theories that are historiographically problematic for many of the rest of us. I mean, I don't know if this is, a carryover from Schumpeterian approaches and the idea that you can talk about long waves of innovation and the tendency to sort of reify technologies or innovation processes in that way. But also, talking about periodization, which is something that I think most historians are very, very cautious about. I don't know, uncritical way, it seems to me, in which you talk about modernity and modernism. In talking to John, you talked about the Enlightenment, and I don't know, I mean, all of those are the kinds of things that I'd want to cite, paraphrase Shapin. There was no such thing as the Enlightenment, and this is a book about it, etc., etc. So there's those kinds of tendencies. It seems to me that they do seem to keep creeping into innovation studies in all sorts of places. And I mean, another one that, as a historian, offends me is Gibbons and Novotny talking about mode 1 and mode 2 knowledge production. I mean, that simply doesn't stand up historically. I'm just wondering if there's still a tendency to introduce theories that, for a historian at least, or for a constructivist historian, are problematic and seem to read too much, impose too much on the materials. But other than that, it seems to me history of science is absolutely crucial for reminding us about things in science technology studies that we need to look at: difference, continuity, change. Potentially, that's something that we can really come together with innovation studies people about as well. But we maybe need to think about exactly the terms on which we do that. Thank you.